Okay, so I've been kind of snagged. I've been hooked. There's Christy Winters there with her little fishing reel there. I've been dragged into a response. This is not a Christy Winters video that I'm responding to, by the way, but it's a kind of Christy Winters production. There's a bit of Christy in there, but there's a lot of her little mates there. And the video is entitled Reasonable Questions for Anti-SJWs. I think it's kind of a response to, there was a video that a few people got together and did something. It was something like white men ask questions of SJWs or something like that. And so they've done this video, Reasonable Questions for Anti-SJWs. I regard myself, ladies and gentlemen, as an anti-SJW, so it behooves me, does it not, to answer this video, albeit this might stretch into multiple parts. I'm hoping to keep it down into 2 parts. We'll see how we get on. Okay, so without further ado, I think we've probably had a sufficiency of ado so far. Let's get on to the first part of the video.
Are you able to understand the irony of responding to the perceived political correctness of the left with exasperated reactionary hypersensitivity of your own?
I'm getting off to a crap start here, but I'm just going to give you this one, right? I'm going to give you this victory, but it's a tatty little victory, right? It's the kind of cheap plastic victory that you'd find in a Christmas cracker and just chuck in the bin, because it's the one through the ages, isn't it? Which is that somebody whines and moans and gripes about something, and I don't know what you expected to do. Just ignore it, because if you don't ignore it, if you challenge it, then somebody says, "Ha! Now you're whining and moaning and griping about them whining and moaning and griping, so you're just as bad as they are." And that's exactly what you're doing here. Some people are being hypersensitive about things, and I presume we're not supposed to mention it, because then if we mention it, now you're being just as hypersensitive about them being hypersensitive as they were being hypersensitive to begin with, so you're just as bad as they are. Okay. Yeah, you win that particular one.
What is it with you people and skulls? No, seriously, what is it with you people and skulls?
Well, hopefully that puts to bed once and for all the ridiculous national stereotype that all British people are funny.
How do you define right-wing? Anti-SJWs often have an aversion to being labelled as right-wing, yet they regularly defend the right and bash the left. Therefore, why is being labelled right-wing a bad thing to you? And if it's because right-wing is used as a pejorative, can you not see how labelling people as SJWs or regressives is also pejorative?
Well, yes, I can see how labelling people SJWs or regressives can also be pejorative, but I have to say, right, just between you and I, Tim, I think a lot of the time when people use that label in a kind of accusatory manner, rather than self-identifying as an SJW, they mean it to be a pejorative there. So I didn't really get where you were going with that. What do you define right wing? It's very difficult, isn't it? And this is part of the reason why people don't like these labels, because there's so many different ways to do it, and most people don't actually fit into those labels, unfortunately, especially nowadays, where there's quite a lot of people, especially online, I would say, that would regard themselves as perhaps socially to the left of centre, but economically to the right of centre. And in fact, that's the way that politics has generally shifted in Western countries. Certainly in the United Kingdom, there's been quite a groundswell amongst all the major political parties, and in terms of the way that the average person thinks, economically to the right. Peter Mandelson, of course, famously, the Labour guy, said, "We're all Thatcherites now with regard to economic policy." But then socially, things have moved very much to the left. I'm quite pleased about both those things, because politics has shifted very much in line with the kind of way that I think there. But other people take that's a very relativistic position, the position that I take, which is that you set that centre ground based on contemporary political opinions and values. Other people are very much more absolutist, aren't they? There are people that I've seen online who, unless you kind of subscribe to Joseph Stalin's liquidization of the kulaks, then you're a right-wing fascist bastard as far as they're concerned. And of course you have the absolutists at the other end of the scale as well. So I think that most people don't like to be subsumed into these labels. And especially with regard when you're sort of that kind of transatlantic vibe, because what we tend to regard as right-wing politics in Europe is very different to that political compass over in the United States. So I could understand people not wanting to be dragged along with that, and for people to think that you're the kind of person that might vote for some kind of twat like Donald Trump if you're labelled right-wing. So that's kind of where I would go with that one.
Rather than telling people you disagree with to drink bleach, wouldn't it be more productive for you to have an actual conversation about the issues you feel matter? Or is it just easier to do the bleach thing?
Okay, I mean, this is news to me. I'm an anti-SJW. I define myself as an anti-SJW, and it's certainly not advice that I've given anybody. And in fact, part of my day job is that in a general sense of a whole basket of issues, we try and reduce risk in communities. And this would go totally against the kind of advice that we would give. In fact, and I did make sure that I checked this just before recording this, the current medical advice is to err away from the drinking of bleach. And also on an intellectual level, I think arguments are best served by both sides providing the best arguments, rather than one side providing perhaps a series of arguments and then the other side responding by chugging away on a bottle of bleach. So leave the bleach in the cupboard and just stick to the arguments would be my advice there.
You claim to be proponents of rational, logical, evidence-based argumentation. That's great. That's entirely laudable. But when I look at your online activity, when I look at, I don't know, for example, your Twitter feed, that's often not what I see. How do you reconcile this claim to be evidence-based and rational and logical against stuff like, oh, I was just trolling you, oh, I was just shitposting, or TLDR?
Hello, Professor Moriarty, and I hope you're well. The little spidey senses were tingling as I listened to this bit, and I get the sense that this is probably aimed specifically at Thunderfoot there and an exchange that you've had with him rather than more generally. But what I will say about this shit posting and trolling and all this kind of thing is that I hate to have to say that it does happen on both sides, but it does happen on both sides. And it reminds me of a guy that you may not be familiar with, but there was a guy called Bewildered Ape who started making videos from an SJW perspective, and they were all exclusively trolling videos designed really just to cause a load of shit, really. And he was very, very popular in certain SJW circles, and it was all regarded as very, very cerebral and highbrow shit posting, effectively, in video form, like it was some kind of fucking high art. But what he was effectively doing was trolling anti-SJWs. So look, I don't know, that doesn't make it right, anybody else doing it, but you know, it's not maybe a subject to get too holier than thou on this particular one.
Are you aware that the ridiculous buzzwords you helped to popularize, like SJW and cuck and regressive, have all lost whatever meaning they once had and only serve now as casual insults and pejoratives to derail any meaningful conversation?
Yeah, interesting. The easy thing to say would be to say, well, the SJW community have played the same game. But do you know what I don't think they have? They've just played a similar game, by and large, but a much more, I've got to take my hat off to them, a much cleverer game, a much more intellectual game, because they've relied more on real-life traction with the terms that are used. Let me try and explain what I mean. Words like cook and mangina, they're just insults. It's just monkeys throwing shit at other monkeys, by and large, right? And the problem with using terms like that, other than they add nothing, they don't add anything to the argument you make, which is one of the reasons I don't use them. But the other reason is that, unfortunately, if you use words like that, to everybody else who's observing that conversation, there's a lot of recoil. You end up getting that shit on yourself when you throw that particular brand of shit, right? It reflects on you as much as the person who you're applying those terms towards. Whereas what I would suggest to you is that the SJW community tend to have boxed a bit clever and use words that have real life traction, like racist and misogynist, but throw them around like verbal confetti. They have the same kind, well, they have perhaps more auto-win capacity to those terms. and they're applied in contexts where they're not really appropriate. Calling somebody a racist, for example, is a great way of shutting down a conversation without actually having discussed the issues. In fact, the Labour Party, the left-wing party in the United Kingdom, admitted as much a few years ago. Several senior members admitted, do you know what, maybe this is something that we've done rather than discussing issues of immigration and the issues that actually need to be discussed. We've kind of stifled any conversation with the auto win of just describing such issues as inherently racist and things that shouldn't even be discussed. And then you get down to this business that I've labelled smearing by equivocation by proxy, which is where you take something, a word like misogynist, for example, which means, or traditionally means, a hatred of women, but you use it to mean something else. Oh Lord, when I use the word misogynist, I'm not suggesting that this person literally hates women. No, all I'm suggesting is something akin to a kind of mild form of sexism, you know, maybe a slightly traditional leaning attitude towards the roles of men and women. But you know full well, and this is the by proxy part of the equivocation, you know full well that when other people hear that word, it means a lot more to them than it would if you were just suggesting some slightly mild sexist traditional attitudes. It's a very, very clever trick that SJWs play in that regard, and if I had a hat on, I'd take my hat off to you. I'd take my hat off. That's what I would do.
In videos and in the comment sections, anti-feminists often take up the most extreme or the weakest feminist position they can find, or they just straight up misrepresent what the feminist position is. Instead, why not take up the strongest, most robust feminist argument you can find and really challenge yourself?
Brilliant. So we've got to the point in the video where Christy sticks her head above the parapet. Hello, Christy, and I hope this video response finds you well. Look, what I've got to say before I start talking, Christy, about the argument that you just made there, is that I kind of irks me and gets a little bit under my skin that all of a sudden you've switched. This is a video aimed at anti-SJWs, and that is, I identify, that's a label I apply to myself, anti-SJW, and I'm not prepared to allow the only responses you get to come from people with perhaps a more radical anti-SJW perspective than my own, right, which will allow you just to tackle those, especially when you make these kind of arguments where you say, surely you should be tackling the best arguments and not the worst arguments, right? So I feel that I have to respond. It behooves me to respond under those circumstances, and yet all of a sudden you've segued in from anti-SJW to anti-feminist. I've never identified as an anti-feminist, right? So it's a bit of a generalization that you're making there to just assume that because somebody is an anti-SJW that they're an anti-feminist, and therefore it's like that's now, you're now impugning all those things on me, that all the baggage that comes with anti-feminism when I've never identified as an anti-feminist. And I know that you can sit there and say, well, that's exactly what these white men asking their questions of SJWs did, because they switched seamlessly apparently from asking questions of SJWs to asking questions of feminists. But I thought that as an academic especially, you held yourself to a higher standard. I thought that you always said that you don't do these kind of things, that you operate at a higher standard. And that brings me on sort of to where we're at here. And I'm seeing the same thing, Christy, that I saw with you with regard to the principle of charity, which in several videos you've talked about the principle of charity and how we all should be applying the principle of charity and applying the best interpretations of arguments rather than the ones that are easiest to smash to pieces, as if that's something that we all should be doing. Yet I hope, certainly to the satisfaction of the vast majority of people who watched those videos that I made, I think I did show that that's not something that you do. It's something that you're expecting of others, but something that you don't seem, a standard you don't seem to hold yourself to. And I'm seeing the same kind of hypocrisy here, Christy, because what you're saying is that we ought to be tackling the best, the strongest feminist arguments and not the weakest feminist arguments. But just riddle me this one, Christy, right? Because one thing I know, because you've said it multiple times, is that you think Sargon of Akkad is something of a joke, you think his arguments are poor, and you think he makes them badly. And yet how many videos have you made, Christy, tackling Sargon of Akkad as an anti-SJW. If you think his arguments are all the weak ones, how come not only have you've gone to such an extent, you've done long hangouts based solely critiquing him, and then serialized them, spun them out into a series of videos, into episodic content, just to make sure that as many people see all those little chunks as possible. How does that square with what you're saying about tackling the best arguments? Will you be tackling Gary Edwards' video? Gary Edwards, if you're not subscribed, folks, to Gary Edwards, just subscribe to Gary Edwards, for God's sake. He has problems and criticisms of SJWs. His video the other day, Atheism Minus, was an excellent video outlining the problems that he has with social justice, warriorism. That isn't the kind of video that you respond to, Christy. So it's almost as if you're making this case for us, but you don't seem to apply the same standard yourself. Look, to answer your question, Christy, because like I say, I don't regard myself, I don't label myself as an anti-feminist, but I do criticise some feminist arguments and positions. So I'll answer the question for myself. Why do I criticise those feminist arguments I regard as bad arguments, and not instead, like some kind of university debating society member, start criticising the good feminist arguments? The flippant answer would be because I'm not a university debating society member, and I don't criticise arguments that I think are good arguments, because by and large arguments that I think are good arguments I don't disagree with. Now there is a slightly more complicated version than that, because it's not quite true that. If I was to draw you a little chart, Christy, right, let's draw a little chart, and on the bottom half is disagreement, and this is all from my perspective, disagreement, and on the top half is agreement, right? That's how we're going to form it. Those arguments that I regard as bad arguments, right, are all going to be in the bottom half, because whatever you think about me, I'm not actually insane. Right, there are no arguments that I regard as bad. You might regard them as terrible arguments, but there's no arguments that I personally regard as bad arguments that I agree with. But I accept there is, if when I put those good arguments in there, right, it does bisect that line a little bit, because there are some arguments that I regard as good arguments. I think they're elegant arguments. I think they're well-made arguments. They may philosophically sound very good, but there are certain real-life positions that just kind of flies in the ointment that just fuck things up, for example, and are superseded by other lines of reasoning or just pure pragmatism. So sometimes there are arguments that I regard as good arguments but I disagree with, but the vast majority of arguments that I regard as good arguments fit in that top half of that chart, Christy. So if you want to know, right, why I tackle the bad feminist arguments, not the good feminist arguments, it's unlike you. The reason that you're tackling the bad anti-SJW arguments is because Sargon of Akkad has a lot of viewers, and you know that will bring a lot of traffic to your channel, right? That's why you do it. The reason that I tackle the bad feminist arguments when I tackle feminist arguments is because those are the arguments that I'm disagreeing with, Christy. I know, baffling reasoning I'm using there, isn't it? But there you go. That's what it is.
I am deeply concerned with male addiction rates, suicide rates, and abuse rates, because I have worked with these issues in the quote-unquote real world. Would you be willing as anti-feminists to put aside your differences with feminists for the greater good of addressing these issues, especially as the kind of solutions needed are not necessarily gendered? And if so, I would actually like you to let me know, because I'm not fucking around or presenting any gotchas here. I actually really think that we could get something done if we work together. So, yeah.
So I think this needs to be maybe the last segment of this first part of the response, because I want to sort of keep the time reasonable. So that means Steve Shives. If you're waiting for my Steve Shives virginity the first time that I'm going to address Steve Shives on this channel, you'll have to wait for part 2. So, look, Chrisiosity, I've heard Chrisiosity before. I quite like Chrisiosity. She seems a real genuine person. I'm sure that what she says, she means absolutely genuinely here. And why not, right? If you're genuinely interested in men's issues, as she obviously is, then why not tackle them? And I don't have an issue with that, and maybe that makes it easier for me because I'm not an anti-feminist. What I will say is that I take issue with men's issues being dealt with under the umbrella of feminism. And I know I'm not making things easy for feminists here, because that means that they're kind of damned if they do and damned if they don't, because there's lots of other people which will say, well, you feminists, what about men's issues? Why is it all about women's issues? Now, I have no problem with feminists dealing with men's issues, but I don't think they should do it with their feminist hat on, because I don't think that it helps men's issues. I think that while feminism is dealing with men's issues under feminism, that men's issues will always be second best, because of the history of the movement, because of the general thrust of what feminism is about, because of the name. I mean, it's the same argument we've made everywhere else. Fireman had to become firefighter chairman, chairperson, because we understood that if we stick with that gendered term, that we'll never be able to achieve a kind of gender blind perspective on those things. And so obviously the same has to apply to feminism, doesn't it? So I don't think it's ever going to be a very good place for men's issues to be dealt with, for those issues to be dealt with purely on their merits, rather than sort of automatically favouring issues that apply to women because they are issues that apply to women. And after all, people will troll out, feminists will troll out, well, feminists have done this for men and feminists have done that for men. But a lot of those things have kind of come about spandrel-like. That they've not happened because feminists have directly tried to do that for men. Often it's come about as a sort of, it's come about because of some change that they've tried to effect for women, and then there's been this happy knock-on effect for men. Or we have this idea that, well, once patriarchy is smashed, men will benefit from that as well, as if women's issues are something that you tackle directly, as well as trying to smash the patriarchy, but men's issues, they'll be dealt with whenever patriarchy is dealt with, sometime never. So I don't think it's a happy place for men's issues. And then there's also this issue for men's rights, and it's maybe a bigger issue than that other one, which is one of the great things about feminism, is that it brings all women's issues together and under that one umbrella. It might be a very broad church with infighting, but at least it's one broad umbrella that's all broadly on the same side with most of those issues. But what you end up with men's rights is this kind of fractious side to it, as a result of, in my view, a kind of land grab from feminism, trying to grab all these other issues as being part of feminism as well, which is something that I'll be discussing in response to Steve Shives actually in the next part of this video. And what it means is that effectively the drive, I don't think men's rights will ever be taken seriously and will ever gain the same kind of movement behind it, the kind of movement that's needed to get that kind of political attention, while you have two groups that are at least purportedly driving it forward that have such antagonism to one another. Curiosity. If you take somebody like in the UK, Ali Fogg, if you're not familiar with Ali Fogg, go look him up. He is a fantastic, in my view, a fantastic advocate of men's rights, and he makes a lot of the cases way better than anybody else. And he is a dyed-in-the-wool card-carrying feminism, does all his men's rights work under the auspices and umbrella of feminism, and has nothing good whatsoever to say about men's rights movements, and tries to distance himself as far as he possibly can from them. Now, I'm not saying he's right, I'm not saying he's wrong. I'm not saying the MRA groups are right or they're wrong from distancing themselves from people like Ali Fogg. What I'm saying is, and I'm sure you'd agree with me on this given what you've said, while ever you have that situation there, that cannot be a healthy situation for men's rights. And I know what your answer is, well, let's all work together and let's all buy the world a fucking Coke and start singing in perfect harmony at the same time, Curiosity. What I'm saying to you is that in my view, feminism has to let go of that. And feminism has to be about issues of equality purely when it is women on the poor side of that. Because actually, if it isn't, I don't actually think it's doing men's issues much good. Because for men's issues to ever get the kind of political traction that they need really to be taken seriously rather than kind of trivialised and scoffed at as they often are in the media and in political circles, they need to be able to pull together, I think. And I really can't see that ever happening properly under feminism, because there's always going to be some people that don't. I mean, there are people in feminist circles, and I'm sure you will appreciate this, that trivialise men's issues. There are people in feminist circles that really don't like men, just the same as there are in these MRA groups, that there are people that really don't like women very much. And we're all aware that these people exist, but you can't expect people all people that are deeply soaked in men's issues to want to work within that umbrella. So you're always going to have this split, and I think you're always going to have that situation within feminism where men's issues, purely on the grounds of being men's issues, they're always relegated slightly, even before the issues themselves are considered. In my view, the answer really is that feminism has to kind of let go of those issues a bit. Be responsible and be sensitive in the main towards men's issues and not simply scoff at them, but try not to make those feminist issues. Try not to say, well, every issue that anybody has is a feminist issue, because actually it might be done in good faith, but all I think it actually does is dilutes and splits the effort towards actually tackling men's issues. Okay, that's pretty much all that I want to say in this part, because I've waffled on for long enough. And so let me take a little bit of a break. I'll go get something to eat here. I'll get on with recording part 2, and you'll see part 2 once it's edited and up and online. Okay, thank you for watching part 1. Bye for now.